Hello, friends, and welcome back to Albion Tonight. Tonight, I have a pretty serious episode for you guys about the history of slavery and food, and I'd like to preface this episode before our introductions by saying that this is by no means a complete history. This is by no means attempting to summarize the entirety of all of the complicated events and emotions and players in this history in one episode. This is just me wanting to address one very, very important, if not the most important side of social history and food, which is the social history that involves the extortion of people and, unfortunately, slaves. And joining me today to talk about this very important topic that breaks my heart is Alex, your very favorite guest star. Say hello.
Hello.
He's back. This is probably the most intense episode you've been here for.
Yay!
Yeah, so suffrage was intense, but this is certainly going to get more intense because even all those suffragettes who were being force-fed certainly went through something probably very different than what the people we're going to talk about today went through.
I mean, those ads were pretty... Those are...
Oh my goodness.
And those recipes and everything.
Yeah. Yeah, every single episode I've had thus far, some of them, of course, have taken place in the Edwardian period, so some of them are starting to move away, but this history has a long legacy, and so every single episode that I've had so far has probably in one way or another been touched by slavery. I can't summarize all of those ways, but I will say some of the ways because some of them are more insidious and complicated and would require a whole episode. But what I will say is I certainly know that the legacy of slavery was involved in the consumption of food and the ways that we advertise and the racism and the discrimination and the looking down on people and the taking advantage of imports for profit and for trying to get people to buy large amounts of numbers of stuff while paying little. Like that really still was going on in the Edwardian period, and there's still a large history of racism, and people who were in slavery were still struggling. But especially the things I've talked about in the Victorian period, that tea was coming from colonies and colonial exploitation, and some of those colonies had slaves. The sugar to sweeten that tea definitely came from slavery for all of the Victorian episodes for the most part. Of course, later Victorian period slavery is abolished, which we'll talk about a bit. And of course, as I mentioned on my soda and fountain drinks episode, it was actually a formerly enslaved man who was a major part of the invention of the soda fountain. And you could probably look back, and a lot of formerly enslaved people are probably responsible for a lot of things that we enjoy today. So, yeah, that's a little bit about why this is so important to the history of food. And now I'm going to give you a little bit of background on slavery, which is about to be very, very sad. So you might say to me, well, Brooke, like, you've had to make all of these little runnings in about, like, how it's related, because wasn't the slave trade, like, abolished early in the 19th century, which is where your podcast started? And, like, wasn't, like, slavery as a whole abolished not much later? Like, the UK abolished it before the United States.
Yeah, what's up with that? I thought they were, like, very proud of that.
Yeah, they really like to brag about it. They really, really do. And I can tell you, yeah, the trafficking and trading of enslaved people across the Atlantic was made illegal in 1807 by a British court case. But that was just the trading across the Atlantic. So that did not stop British colonial territories, especially those in the West Indies like Jamaica and Bermuda, from continuing to use enslaved labor to produce foods like sugar and rum. And they also were still able to trade amongst themselves on the colony. They just couldn't kidnap anybody else from Africa and send them over the ocean. So abolition of the slave trade is not the same thing as stopping slavery. And also, in the colonies where there were already slaves, they were then, of course, like, sexually assaulting women and having them reproduce, like, more slaves for them. And so it in no means stopped this awful system from being perpetuated. And then we get to a very beautiful thing. You'll say, okay, that sounds pretty bad, but 1833, that's the date Britain gives for the emancipation of slavery. And yes, this is when the court case went through that abolished slavery. But this is what they decided. They said, we're still really, really racist, awful people. And so we don't think that enslaved people can just, like, be free just like that. Because obviously we should be the people to decide that. So they made people who were enslaved still do a quote-unquote apprenticeship from 1834 to 1838, where they were still bound to work for their quote-unquote masters for 4 years while they learned how to be free.
How do you learn to be free?
Exactly. It's very vague. It's just like, you dumb, like, you need to learn how to be a person.
Reincorporation into, like, society? I don't...
Yeah, and also just because, like, a lot of the slave owners were mad at the British government, so, like, we're not taking them away right away. You have, like, 4 years to, like, let go of them. Really bad. Yeah. And also because there was this widespread belief of the inferiority that, like, different skin tones actually equaled somehow these major genetic differences, and that somehow the people they were enslaving were not that smart, and so somehow they needed help. And I'd also just like to say that this doctrine, this scientific racism, is what we historians call it, it came about after colonization and after slavery. So it was, like, actually an excuse for slavery, because once people started being like, wow, that's another person that I just made do that awful task and then didn't pay him anything. And then they're like, oh, but, like, what if there's, like, a reason that it's okay? And then there were all these scientists that came around to justify it. Yay. So, yeah. And then the other thing is the government paid 20 million pounds to who? Who do you think the British government paid 20 million pounds to when they abolished slavery?
Probably the people using slaves, because they're probably losing labor costs and stuff like that, because they actually have to pay people.
Yep. They basically paid them back for the people they were losing.
That doesn't seem right.
Yeah, it's really bad. Like 20 million pounds. I think that's the equivalent today.
Per person or just in general?
These are my history notes from my Victorian history class, and I think...
I'm sure it's overall, because you can't just give 20 million pounds per person.
But it was quite a bit per person.
That actually doesn't even seem like that much. I mean, I don't know how many people they're paying, or, like...
It was a lot. I will tell you that regardless of the details of this number, they were giving back a lot to these people. They're basically, like, paying them because, yeah, they quote-unquote, like, lost the labor, even though really the people who have been wronged in this whole thing are not the people who are owning other people. So, yeah, that's a little bit about why slavery definitely has a hold for longer on the time period I specialize in. I will say in this episode, we're going to dip a little bit back into the 1700s, like the late 1700s, because it's so important to the story of what happened to people who were enslaved and the ways in which all of, like, the British Empire and all of the food inventions of the time and the ability to feed so many people and mass produce so many foods, how that was dependent on slavery for so long, and how it kind of has this legacy, and even as it's being phased out, how it's kind of still having this holdover in this period of quote-unquote apprenticeship. Okay, another point very quickly about British slavery. It was very insidious because all of the enslavement, when it was legal, was concentrated away from its main shores, especially after the abolition of the Slave Trade Act. So Britain, unlike the U.S., can very easily be like, well, you don't see the enslaved people. You don't see their owners beat them. So maybe it's like not that bad, guys. Maybe it's not that bad. Because if you can't see something, it's easy to tell yourself a story about it that you want to believe. So even if you're a British person living in London and like you're reading all these awful newspaper stories and the abolitionists are telling you certain things, it's still easy to be like, oh, well, is it really that bad? Because you don't actually have to look these people in the face who are having their lives taken away from them day by day. And then I want to mention, don't worry, guys, we really are going to get into food. This context is important. I want to also mention, though, that in these acts that eventually came about because of partially abolitionist efforts in terms of public sentiment, but actually in legal sentiment, they came about mostly because of economic changes. Because slavery was a corrupt economic system. And because Britain was given other ways from their other colonies and like other proposals for like how to have free market capitalism, they were like, oh, I guess we can do that instead of slavery. But it wasn't until there was another viable economic alternative that they were willing to abolish it, even though abolitionists were saying things for years. But what did help with the abolition of slavery were people who were actually in slavery themselves. They did stuff for themselves. And that is really important to the story. So one of the cases that helped weaken the hold on slavery in the UK, one of the most famous cases, is called the Somerset case. It happened in 1771. And so because slavery was really weird in Britain, like I said, it's all concentrated in the colonies where you don't actually have to like look at it if you're living in the UK, like on those shores. Slavery is actually like kind of not cool on the UK's shores, but it's fine for them to use it for all the food coming in. So what happens is there's this guy named James Somerset, and his owner says he has the right to take him wherever he wants. And he takes Somerset to the British Isles when he's traveling. And so Somerset takes us to the court. And it's like, well, now that I'm on British soil, I should be free because the British law for British soil says that, like, all men are free on British soil.
Oh, that's so smart.
Yeah.
That's so smart.
Yeah. I believe... he kind of tried to, like, have freedom of movement, and his, like, quote-unquote owner was like, oh, this is not okay. And then he's like, well, actually, we're in England, buddy, now. And the court, as much as, like, many people tried to be like, the court just couldn't support it. If you look at British law, it's like, yeah, you can't have not free people on British soil.
Wow. So
it started to chip away the idea that the legal institution cannot forever support slavery. And, like, this case was kind of complicated because, like, British history books really like to paint this as, like, ta-da, slaves are free on British Isles, progress. But that wasn't, like, the total ruling. The ruling was specifically that Somerset was right in this one case.
Okay.
But for, like, the public, this is really important to this idea. And then there's a guy named Joseph Knight in Scotland, whose case I will also have in the sources. And he does, like, basically the same thing, but in Scotland. So James Somerset was in England, and Joseph Knight, he is enslaved in one of the colonies. His master takes him to Scotland, and he's like, well, Scottish law doesn't support people being on slavery on Scottish land. So very similar case, and there's a couple more people that brought these. So I just want to say, too, it's great to think about all of the people who were trying to do the right thing at this time. But I personally think, once again, this is like my opinion because it's my podcast, so I can editorialize a bit. But I think that it's most important to remember that there were so many people that were enslaved that were actively and often doing things to try and take down the system themselves, or at least free themselves personally. All right. Now, food and slavery and more sad things. Any questions about the context before we keep going?
I mean, I don't want to get too much off a tangent. I just but who did they go to? Like when they set foot, did they tell that to their masters? Do they just go up to a random person?
Sometimes they tried to go to the court, but usually what happened is a lot of times they would go to the court through an abolitionist society because abolitionist societies existed in London for quite a large part of the 1700s and also in England in general, in London and the major port cities and also most places. There was abolitionist organizations, and the abolitionist organizations were mainly white British people, so they would go to the court on the behalf, or they would second the plea.
Okay. Interesting.
Yeah. All right. So, of course, slavery involved transporting people across the Middle Passage for a long time, holding them in very tight ship quarters. And one of the things that would happen when people were taken from Africa is that they were fed food to keep them alive because they were being treated as sellable goods and not as people. And in the same way, maybe people still treat horse and cattle today. I don't love that comparison because I'm an English major and it's really complicated, and you can read a lot of literature on why it's really complicated. But they were really thought about as we're going to sell these people when we get to shore. So we want to make sure they survive. But also, of course, the companies that are transporting them across the Middle Passage are mainly thinking about the best way to make money. So they're not going to bring fresh fruits and vegetables because that doesn't make sense on the ocean, for one, and also because it's pricier. So a lot of people on the Middle Passage are just being fed about 2 meals a day. It's usually cassava, grains, corn from North America, barley, peas, rice, yams, beans, and really salted meats. And sometimes, there was bread occasionally, which, of course, was really popular in the day. But sometimes bread would actually make it hard for people to digest the other things. So just a lot of digestive issues. And also a lot of things are heavily salted and preserved, which led to increased dehydration. And water access was often a huge problem on ships transporting enslaved people. Yeah, a lot of the food, too, also went bad and got consumed by gross bugs and things. And, there's just, a lot of sour, nasty, icky food that was being fed to these people or being denied to these people. Any thoughts, questions?
No, I mean...
Concerns? It's pretty straightforward. It's mainly just sad. Yeah, and then this diet was pretty repetitive, and the servings were usually more meager when you were in the middle of the ocean. But then the week before they knew they were going to reach land, the week before they knew they were going to reach Jamaica or the United States, then they would feed people a lot better so that they'd appear really healthy when people went to buy them. Another really interesting thing, this is more tangential, but it's a really interesting thing I saw in my research, is that there was chocolate traded for slaves. It's really bad. Basically, merchants exported 459,347 pounds of chocolate to colonies in North America for a variety of goods. So it's being traded. And then, this is a quote from an article, by the way. And then they shipped 1,950 pounds to Africa to exchange for slaves.
Chocolate? They shipped...
Chocolate.
Why would they ship chocolate to Africa?
Chocolate and cacao. Because they traded... One of the ways that people were obtained, the way people were kidnapped, was, unfortunately, a lot of colonial forces took advantage of tensions within African communities, and so other Africans would sell fellow Africans.
Oh,
so there were people, if, like, you did not belong, like, think today of, like, there's a lot of groups that live in the same country that have a lot of tension with each other.
Mm-hmm.
And then somebody comes up and is like, hey, those people you're warring with, I'll give you chocolate and I'll take them away for you.
So it's just like a commodity in a way. So they're just like trading back commodities. And they're like, okay, we'll take back some of our chocolate and then in return we'll sell you more people. That's crazy.
Yeah, it's really bad. And it's just one example of how dehumanizing this process was. So, yeah, men and women are literally kind of being equivocated with chocolate. Then, interestingly, too, another thing that I found out was, like, in North America, chocolate was starting to become a lot more common. Like, for example, Alex and I have been to a colonial fair where they talk a lot about how colonists used to make hot chocolate. And so also it is potentially one thing that people living in the colonies gave to their slaves to drink or eat on occasion. So it's hard to really recreate what that diet would have been like, and I'm not sure exactly what the value is, but I think sometimes, especially in countries like the United Kingdom and the United States, where there is like this opportunity for a variety of food, to think about what people feed people, I think is just interesting. And I also think it's interesting to do a history from the ground, since we don't have as much information or sources on like what the actual lived experience was of enslaved people, because people tried to keep those stories quiet. It's just interesting to learn little facts here and there about what they could have or maybe had access to. All right. Now, we've got a bit on abolitionists before we move into the voices of enslaved people themselves. And as I said, even though they're limited, they definitely exist and in numbers. So first, we'll talk a little bit about the abolitionist movement. So one of the things that the abolitionist movement did to try and stop slavery and discourage slavery is kind of attack it from the foundation that a lot of pro-slavery supporters supported it on, which was, it makes us lots of money. And so the abolitionists were like, guys, what if instead of all that sugar cane that we are using forced labor to grow in the West Indies, what if we used maple?
Wow.
The Canadians, they've got maple. We got maple sugar. And like indigenous peoples in North America also often, the ones that lived like where maple trees were, had some sort of maple sugar, maple syrup in their diets. And so they were kind of fascinated by that and were like, well, they do it, so we could do it. It seems to work. Maple never was able to, they were never able to give it that much of a footing. But next time you have maple syrup, you can think about that there were large efforts to make that a viable competitor. And they tried to take it very seriously. It grew in a temperate climate, so they thought we could actually, like, grow it in England. Or, like, grow it here, and then like it could be ethical and people could get paid to grow it or grow it in their gardens or something of their big estates.
Yeah, it's a good thing that people are still thinking about that. Like, it makes me feel good that people are like thinking about that and considering that.
Yeah, it's nice to know. It's nice to know that people were trying to do the right thing. They also tried to encourage the use of sugar beets. You can make sugar from beets. Where we live, there's actually a history of that too. So they also tried to make that happen, and that happened later on than the abolitionists wanted, because they started trying to do this as early as like the 1780s and 1790s. But after the Napoleonic Wars and stuff, there's this whole like economic borrowing of France from the UK. So France had to use sugar beets instead of sugar cane. And then it made sugar beets viable. So in the 1880s, sugar beets had like their heyday, but it was after slavery was over.
Unfortunate.
Yeah. So those are some of the things they tried to do. The other big one, and this is one where women really start to come into our story, is that there were a lot of anti-slavery boycotts in Britain itself. So even if they couldn't make the maple or the sugar beets happen, they said, I do not want to eat sugar grown by slaves.
Yeah, that's fair. And, maybe even today, I don't even know how much someone would have to look this up. I don't know. I think I still hear things of like free trade chocolate and sugar and stuff like that. And it's still crazy to think, like, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but like so many years later, like hundreds of years later, this is something we still have to like think about. Yeah. And like deal with. And it's still a problem. It's wild. Like, people have been working on this problem for so long. And it's still kind of like, oh, it's kind of hidden. You don't see it,
Yeah, well, because, like, we export our chocolate and our sugar from other countries, and it's the same thing of, oh, I'm sure it comes from paid labor. We don't have slavery anymore, but
we don't know.
We don't know where our food is coming from, and that's also why I say just because slavery was abolished for part of the time periods I've talked about, that does by no means that, like, the foods and the inventions that we're talking about came about ethically. So, yeah, anti-slavery boycotts, quote, this is a quote from a source on the maple sugar substitutes and the boycotts as well. Anti-slavery boycotts first initiated by the British in the 1790s, which also targeted cotton, tobacco, rice, indigo, and other commodities with intensive economic involvements of enslaved Africans in the free produce movement, and lasted until the 1840s. So there was sort of a free produce movement similar to like the Fair Trade Certified movement now, of like, I want to know that this comes from a place that isn't using like forced labor. And one of the major players in these movements were often women, because a lot of times women were purchasing some of the items for the home, like the cooking supplies, like the sugar, or also they were purchasing plates and bowls. And one of the most famous, like, anti-slavery sugar artifacts are these Wedgwood and other pottery sugar bowls that we know about. And they say things like, sorry, I'm pulling up the picture. They say things like East India sugar, not made by slaves. However, East India sugar was made through the colonial labor going on in India. So there's no ethical consumption under capitalism. But they tried.
Wait, what do you mean it was made by the, like, were they paid? Like, what?
So colonial labor
what is
different than slavery. Next episode, I'll have even more details on this. But the thing with colonial labor is it's not the same as legalized slavery and that there usually is some form of compensation. However, there is still a lot of coercion and unfair power dynamics. Like, think of, like, a company that, like, holds the power to, like, kill your family or something if you quit.
Okay.
Like that kind of
like
vibe.
Like a servant, like an indentured, like a...
Sort of. But sometimes indentured servants work for free because they're, like, paying off a debt. Whereas, like, here, like, people might be getting compensated by their labor, but you kind of invade someone's home, and then you...
I guess
say,
they did invade
this is
the land.
The industry, like, you invade India, and you say, this is the industry we're doing now, and you're growing it for us instead of for yourselves. And... you might not get compensated how you want. You might get compensated fairly, but also, like, we are the colonial power, and basically, like, we control most aspects of your life.
Okay, yeah. I see.
So, different.
Yeah.
Different. Still winning on one front, but not all of them were East India sugar. There were other ones of just, like, sugar not made by slaves and people trying to get it. But also, this is a similar, like, catch-22 that we have in the consumerist world we live in today, too, and can relate of, like, you have women living in England who are perhaps really sad about what's going on and wanting to change the world around them and wanting to change the systems. And the thing that they can do in their life while they're worrying about their, like, raising their children or worried about, like, trying to pursue their own interests or their own, like, studies or being a governess. Like, this frustration of, I want to change the system, but at the same time, the best they were doing, and we can hold them accountable for this, but also relate it to our own experiences, trying to, by conspicuous consumption of things that were, like, branded as anti-slavery, or by trying to buy goods that were not made by slaves, they were trying to make a difference in their own way. But it's really hard because there's all these governmental and economic forces that are stronger than them, that you're, like, still supporting colonialism or you're still supporting some sort of extortion one way or another. And it makes me sad. But yeah, so in these sugar boycotts, it was typically headed by Quakers. As well, because the Quakers were always really big on not owning people. And they were always really big on, like, a lot of the rights movements of the time, because they really were kind of like peace and love. There's also this man, we're going to get back to the women, but there's this man named William Fox who was an important part of the abolitionist movement. And he wrote in the 1700s, he wrote a pamphlet entitled An Address to the People of Great Britain on the Propriety of Abstaining from West India Sugar and Rum. So this is kind of like the basis that these boycotts would go on for years of, like, this is kind of the argument. So this is one of the things he says, and it's pretty fire. The consumption of sugar in this country is so immense that the quantity commonly ingested by individuals will have an important effect. A family that uses only 51 pounds of sugar per week with the proportion of rum will be abstaining from the consumption 21 months. By abstaining from the consumption for 21 months, prevent the slavery or murder of one fellow creature. 8 such families in 19 years prevent the slavery or murder of a lot, and 38,000 would totally prevent the slave trade to supply our lands. Nay, so necessarily connected are our consumption of the commodity and the misery resulting from it, that in every pound of sugar, the produce of slaves imported from Africa, we might as well be considered as consuming 2 ounces of human flesh, besides destroying an alarming number of our fellow men by the slave trade.
I can't believe
quote.
You, like, sorry, I know you can't see this. I don't know what text document you're reading. Those words, they're like every F or every letter S is the letter F in the document. I don't know why.
It's 1700s English.
That's crazy.
It's
How did you read that?
1700s print. I apologize. I should have read it from the original page. I read it from my copy of the page. Here, let me
No, you're
read
good.
it.
I'm
Let me
just
read
impressed.
the last sentence one more time.
I'm so impressed.
Nay, so necessarily connected our consumption of the commodity and the misery resulting from it, that in every pound of sugar used, the produce of slaves imported from Africa, we may be considered as consuming 2 ounces of human flesh, besides destroying an alarming number of seamen by the slave trade, and spreading inconceivable anguish, terror, and dismay through an immense continent by the burning of their villages, tearing parents from their families and children from their parents, breaking every bond of society and destroying every source of human happiness. A French writer observes that he cannot look on a piece of sugar without conceiving it stained with spots of human blood. And Dr. Franklin adds that had he taken in all the consequences, he might have seen the sugar not merely spotted, but thoroughly dyed scarlet in grain.
Wow.
End quote. So basically he's saying eating sugar is cannibalism.
Wow.
Of our fellow humans.
Mic drop. It's a good quote. I got to give it to him. Those were bars.
Yeah. I, too, would want to participate in the sugar boycott after reading about this. The other thing that I do want to mention is that it allowed a way for women to participate in these sort of political statements and in these sort of political conversations, because you could then have this form of protest at your tea table, which, as we talked about, were very much considered in the feminine sphere and feminine coded, as if tea was like a language that only women understood. And so for them to be able to bring this kind of protest and these kind of statements to the table, they're actually making that feminine coded place into a place where these very important conversations that the fate of humanity hangs on are being had at their tables, or at least sitting there on their tables. So
it's a social statement.
Yeah, it's a social statement. Also, there's the Victoria and Albert Museum says that, quote, recent research also suggests that some women's abolitionist societies commissioned their own anti-slavery sugar tableware by well-known makers such as Herbert Minton, with profits going towards their cause, end quote. So they also were actually participating in producing, like making sure that these goods were produced.
Wow. I'm actually surprised, like that far back. Like, I know it was a problem in their time and they wanted to take care of it, but that makes me, like, again, that makes me feel kind of, like, it makes me feel good.
It makes you feel better.
People, cared, like, that much. It's kind of like, again, like today, like the fair trade type of deal, but it's like, yeah. Because that was such a prominent issue in their time, and they're just like, yeah, so adamant about it, Like, it's really complicated because, of course, we can really talk about like how in some ways there's hypocrisy here, or in some ways the sugar might not actually have been untouched by extortion or by forced labor. But at the same time, there is a sense that, people aren't totally naive or ignorant. And even though we can always say we wish people handled this differently or did more, just what I always wish is that we never had to deal with such a corrupt system because people just wanted more money and more goods and would use whatever means they could to obtain it. But I think it is good that people know that these things were going on almost the whole time. Yeah, I never knew that. Like some people can always look back in history and it was like, oh, everyone. Like, yeah, there were some, there's the abolitionists, but it was like, other than that, mostly everyone didn't. I mean, it's very complicated, and people are very complicated, Yeah. So you don't know, like, how, these are, like, things, like, not a lot of people talk about. You don't really know how, like, the way people acted or thought or things like that. So it's interesting to see this as, like, a, some sort of societal, like, thing, like, with the sugar, like, the picture you showed me with, like, the thing that said, this is not made with slave labor. Mm-hmm. And things like that, and the silverware, stuff like that. You can kind of like almost like, show other people like, hey, look, this is what I support. And then, they can like spread from there. And, like these are just things like I just never knew about. And like, you just kind of assume and hope that there were good people, that people like cared back then. Yeah. I just always like thought that. I'm like, well, I hope there were people that thought this way, and it's such a complicated, like, history, and sometimes it's really easy to say, like, oh, everyone was terrible,
Yeah.
But
it's really messy, like today.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe even more messy, but it's also important to realize how awful it was. But yeah, another thing that I thought was very apt that the V&A pointed out on their like descriptions of some of their objects in their collection was, quote, although anti-slavery goods successfully spread their message to a wider audience, like you were saying, we should be reminded that objects like the sugar bowl were a performative display of solidarity. White, middle, and upper class people could display these objects while doing little else for the abolitionist cause. The absurdity of this performance is clearly felt when contrasting the decorous act of taking tea sans sugar as a form of protest with the violence to which enslaved people were subjected. Although the support of British people was imperative in the fight for abolition, we should not let this overshadow the conscious resistance initiated by enslaved people in securing their own freedom. End quote.
Yeah, okay.
Kind of like the people I said. Now, this isn't saying everybody did this.
Yeah.
It's just something to remember that there is also sort of this irony in the peaceful and decorous act of being able to take tea while people are probably being beaten and raped and murdered.
My guess is, like, it made you, like, feel better. Like, maybe you felt like a sort of, like, sense of guilt,
Yeah.
And, like, to come to terms with it. And it's like, oh, I'll do this one thing to, like, repent for my sins or whatever and make me feel better. And then, like, don't care about it for the rest of the week or whatever. So it's like the one thing you do for your week. You do your one good thing for the week, and it helped out.
I picked up a piece of trash, and now I have prevented global warming.
I held open the door for someone. Yeah, something like that.
Or I told people children are starving in Africa, but then I'm going to eat this Nestle chocolate that was made by
it could also be used as something like, oh, look at me, like I'm such a good person.
Yeah, like
everyone adores
pontificating.
Me. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's a very complicated history for sure, but also something that I think should be noted, and I will say was often done by women because there was this social... It's really interesting because in one way it's women going against the social grain, and then in the other, women were considered responsible for the moral welfare of society, as I've talked about before. And so seeing... And in some ways, maybe perhaps they still are. So it was very common for women and encouraged for women to be part of charity societies or church societies. And so sometimes they started to take the form of these abolitionist societies, but they got very involved in social issues in ways that people maybe started to be uncomfortable with or try to criticize. Like, for example, in Bleak House, Charles Dickens has this character named Mrs. Jellyby, who I could write a thesis on, but she neglects her children and neglects her house because she's always trying to write letters to, like, free people in Africa. And Charles Dickens makes fun of this. Like, it's a bad thing. But it's like, no, this woman's just, like, put all of her time and energy into, like, trying to... Like, he's kind of modeling it off of people he sees dedicating themselves to causes like this. And... yeah, in some way, it's like we can say, oh, they're kind of hypocritical, and we can see that in characters like Mrs. Jellyby. But at the same time, you also kind of have this reading against the grain where you see that there are, like, women kind of being, like, consumed by this desire to, like, change something that is out of their control, but is also partially in their control. So it's really complicated, but there are women involved in trying to stop it. There are also women involved in trying to stop it that were enslaved. Like the end of this quote says, the most important part is that there was conscious resistance initiated by enslaved people in securing their own freedom. So I apologize that all of the context took much longer than initiated. I am very passionate about trying to capture the nuances of the subject, but now I really, really want to get into the voices of enslaved people, because that's really how this whole history should honestly be told. So, there were many formerly enslaved people who were part of abolition societies who did a lot of the heavy lifting in a complicated but meaningful history. So, in the late 1700s in Britain, there is a man named Alaura Equiano and a man named Cugliano, and these are both men who were formerly enslaved, who escaped, who, when they made their escape, they went to the abolition societies because that is where a lot of people went when you've been taken away from your home and your country. And so you go to the only people that are advertising that they're on your side. And they told their stories. These are published stories that I will have linked at the bottom. I'm not going to read from their stories today, which is not a purposeful omission. I have some other things I am going to read from, but I sincerely encourage you to read their stories. It gets really complicated because since they went to the abolition societies and the abolition societies were like, let's publish their stories, there were people within the abolition societies being like, no, you should say it that way, or you should say it this way, or you shouldn't tell people that part, or you should really emphasize the religiosity of this, because they're trying to use rhetoric to get a certain point across. And sometimes, too, it led to people expressing things in ways that might have become more natural for them having lived in the society of British people for so long, but also in ways that, seem very much like curated for British approval, but that does not make them dishonest at all. But it just gets really complicated because it gets sad because we finally get to hear people's voices, but then there's editors, and we don't know how much the editors were actually involved in editing those stories. Then we have Frederick Douglass, who you probably have heard about in the United States. Also, go read The Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass. Very good piece of literature and true story about his life. We also, in England, have a woman who published her story. She ran away to Scotland, I believe, and her name was Mary Prince. And I'm going to read some passages from her because I feel like a lot of the stories I read about slavery growing up were the men's side of things, because even with severe racism, a lot of times the stories that we end up getting to hear are like men's experience, which like sometimes gender didn't affect it as much, but the one way that gender did really affect slavery is in the violence and in the consideration of potentially dooming your children to that too. And of course men had that too, because like sometimes enslaved people would get married or would be in like a consistent relationship, but there's just a lot of pressure about your body as a woman that takes on some specific nuances that are really interesting that we don't always get. And I don't want to harp on those or like relive those or rehash those traumas that people had to go through, but I'm excited that I found her narrative because I personally didn't know about it before, although I'm sure some people in Britain do. And Joseph Knight, he did the court case, but he also wrote a little bit about his experiences. Also, just a huge shout out to the Haitian Revolution. Before we move on.
We have like 5 segments in between.
There is so much information. I really should have made this a whole season. And maybe in a future season it will be. But Toussaint L'Ouverture, enslaved people had an uprising. They gained their freedom and created an independent country. And they are honestly responsible for a lot of the thought about abolition and really bringing it to mind that, for one, it could happen, that enslaved people could be free. And for two, that it was possible for countries to have these revolutions and to change and to encourage these ideas of freedom. And also, even if people were not in favor, the idea that, oh, wow, like these people rebelled against their quote unquote masters and like took over the country does put fear in the British's hearts that, oh, maybe having slaves isn't the safest thing because they're going to rebel too. So it really does start to chip away at slavery as a whole, and also just ideas of freedom, ideas of revolution, ideas of like what people can accomplish. So huge shout out. Let's just clap for them a little bit. Okay, now finally the part that I was wanting to be the whole episode. Okay, these are the voices of enslaved people. This is the closest I can get to firsthand accounts or critical fabulation, which I will get to in a second. So I try to let their voices speak for themselves. I try not to editorialize or to make this about what I want from the story or what I want from this episode. I refuse to deny that it is hard to approach this without feeling like I'm still taking advantage of people who are already taken advantage of. Yet, my silence feels worse than to let history speak. So I wanted to make an episode. It is completely unfair and misleading of me to do a whole season on food and social history and not speak about what is actually the main part of that history: enslavement, coercion, and extortion, and where our food came from and where it does come from. But I mainly will be reading some primary passages. I might try to add a few words perhaps for context, but I mainly just want to read them and just let them sit. So I'm going to go to Mary Prince, and this is just a couple of her experiences. I might summarize some of them. We'll see. So there is a time, there's just been a giant storm. She's enslaved in the West Indies. And she says, "Some little time after this," which was the storm, "one of the cows got loose from the stake and eat one of the sweet potato slips. I was milking when my master found it out. He came to me, and without any more ado, stooped down, and taking off his heavy boot, he struck me such a severe blow in the small of my back that I shrieked with agony and thought I was killed, and I feel weakness in that part to this day. The cow was frightened at his violence, and kicked down the pail and spilt the milk all about. My master knew that this accident was his own fault, but he was so enraged that he seemed glad of an excuse to go on with his ill usage. I cannot remember how many licks he gave me then, but he beat me till I was unable to stand and till he himself was weary. After this, I ran away and went to my mother, who was living with Mr. Richard Darrell. My poor mother was both grieved and glad to see me. Grieved because I had been so ill-used, and glad because she had not seen me for a long, long while. She dared not receive me into the house, but she hid me up in a hole in the rocks near, and brought me food at night, after everybody was asleep. My father, who lived at Crow Lane, over the saltwater channel, at last heard of my being hid up in the cavern, and he came and took me back to my master. Oh, I was loath to go back, but as there was no remedy, I was obliged to submit." End quote. Then this is from another portion of her narrative later on. She, which is who she calls her mistress, which is her enslaver's wife, and who is also an enslaver herself. She used to sit up very late, frequently even until morning, and I had then to stand at a bench and wash during the greater part of the night, or pick wool and cotton, and often I have dropped down overcome by sleep and fatigue, till roused from a state of stupor by the whip and forced to start up to my tasks. End quote. Then going further on into her narrative. Quote, "Poor Hetty, my fellow slave, was very kind to me, and I used to call her my aunt. But she led a most miserable life, and her death was hastened, at least the slaves all believed and said so, by the dreadful chastisement she received from my master during her pregnancy. It happened as follows. One of the cows had dragged the rope away from the stake to which Hetty had fastened it and got loose. My master flew into a terrible passion and ordered the poor creature to be stripped quite naked, notwithstanding her pregnancy, and to be tied up to a tree in the yard. He then flogged her as hard as he could lick, both with the whip and cowskin, till she was all over streaming with blood. He rested and then beat her again and again. Her shrieks were terrible. The consequence was that poor Hetty was brought to bed before her time and was delivered after severe labor of a dead child. She appeared to recover after her confinement, so far that she was repeatedly flogged by both master and mistress afterwards, but her former strength never returned to her. Ere long, her body and limbs swelled to a great size, and she lay on a mat in the kitchen till the water burst out of her body and she died. All the slaves said that death was a good thing for poor Hetty, but I cried very much for her death. The manner of it filled me with horror. I could not bear to think about it. Yet it was always present to my mind for many a day. After Hetty died, all her labors fell upon me in addition to my own. I had now to milk 11 cows every morning before sunrise, sitting among the damp weeds to take care of the cattle as well as the children and to do the work of the house. There was no end to my toils, no end to my blows. I lay down at night and rose up in the morning in fear and sorrow, and often wished that, like poor Hetty, I could escape from this cruel bondage and be at rest in the grave. But the hand of that God, whom then I knew not, was stretched over me, and I was mercifully preserved for better things. It was then, however, my heavy lot to weep, 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 and that for years, to pass from one misery to another, and from one cruel master to a worse. But I must go on with the thread of my story. End quote. And then later on, as she gets closer to escaping, I have a few more passages. So she starts to suffer from rheumatism while they're traveling, but she still is expected to do all the same things. Also from the last passage I read, I don't want to comment too much, but I just want to think about what it means for her to talk about how she could not bear to think about these things, but she must go on with the thread of her story, and also the fact that the thing that really, really sucks about slavery is that there's these awful traumas that people had to go through, and then they had to rehash them to try and convince people to stop making them go through trauma. And it's just like, why do they have to tell it for us to know? And it's just something to think about. And also just, yeah, there's just a lot of violence against, there's just a lot of violence. And it's really interesting how contrasted this still is with ideas of words like confinement and still trying to humanize these situations and bring that respectability and that sense of like order to a situation like a pregnancy. Like words like confinement were related to respectability at this time, and to see that so juxtaposed with just so much violence really highlights just like how nonsensical this system was. It's just completely nonsensical. And a great book for that is Beloved, but it's just so nonsensical. But then here's a little bit on her freedom. Shortly after, the cook left them, the people who had owned her, and then matters went on 10 times worse. I always washed the child's clothes without being commanded to do it, and anything else that was wanted in the family, though still I was very sick indeed. When the great washing came round, which was every 2 months, my mistress got together again a great many heavy things, such as bed ticks, bed coverlets, etc., for me to wash. I told her I was too ill to wash such heavy things that day because of the rheumatism. She said she supposed I thought myself a free woman, but I was not, and if I did not do it directly, I should be instantly turned out of doors. I stood a long time before I could answer, for I did not know well what to do. I knew that I was free in England, but I did not know where to go or how to get my living, and therefore I did not like to leave the house. But Mr. Wood said he would send for a constable to thrust me out, and at last I took courage and resolved that I would not be longer thus treated, but would go trust to Providence. This was the 4th time they had threatened to turn me out, and go where I might, I was determined now to take them at their word, though I thought it very hard, after I had lived with them for 13 years, and worked for them like a horse, to be driven out in this way, like a beggar. My only fault was being sick, and therefore unable to please my mistress, who thought she never could get work enough out of her slaves, and I told them so, but they only abused me and drove me out. This took place from 2 to 3 months, I think, after we came to England.
So they were in Scotland before?
Or she might have gone to England because her documents are in the Scottish Museum. Okay. But I believe she went to England.
Okay. They had the same laws there, I'm assuming?
They had the same laws. They were both part of the United Kingdom by this point, or starting to be. although there's there's a difference between the law. This is just me being an annoying historian. There's a difference between the law that makes the United Kingdom a thing, but England and Scotland since the 1600s have carried on under similar laws. Okay. We're getting to the part where she gets free, guys. It's getting a little bit better, I guess. Quote, "And so I came out and went and carried my trunk to the Moravians. I then returned back to Mash the shoeblack's house." These are people who were trying to assist her in her escape, "and begged his wife to take me in. I had a little West Indian money in my trunk, and they got it changed for me. This helped to support me for a little while. The man's wife was very kind to me. I was very sick, and she boiled nourishing things up for me. She also sent for a doctor to see me, and he sent me medicine, which did me good, though I was ill for a long time with the rheumatic pains. I lived a good many months with these poor people, and they nursed me and did all that lay in their power to serve me. The man was well acquainted with my situation, as he used to go to and fro to Mr. Wood's house to clean shoes and knives, and he and his wife were very sorry for me, ... I am often much vexed, and I feel great sorrow when I hear some people in this country say that the slaves do not need better usage and do not want to be free. They believe the foreign people who deceive them and say slaves are happy. I say not so. How can slaves be happy when they have the halter round their neck and the whip upon their back, and are disgraced and thought no more of than beasts, and are separated from their mothers and husbands and children and sisters, just as cattle are sold and separated? It is happiness for a driver in the field to take down his wife or sister or child. Is it happiness for a driver in the field to take down his wife or sister or child and strip them and whip them in such a disgraceful manner? Women that have had their children exposed in the open field to shame. There is no modesty or decency shown by the owner to his slaves. Men, women, and children are exposed alike. Since I have been here, I have often wondered how English people can go out into the West Indies and act in such a beastly manner." So yeah, she was specifically in England, but Scotland has some of her documents. "But when they go to the West Indies, they forget God and all feeling of shame, I think, since they can see and do such things. They tie up slaves like hogs, moor them up like cattle, and they lick them so as hogs or cattle or hearses never were flogged. And yet they come home and say, and make some good people believe, that slaves don't want to get out of slavery, but they put a cloak about the truth. It is not so. All slaves want to be free. To be free is very sweet. I will say the truth to English people who may read this history that my good friend, Miss S., is now writing down for me. I have been a slave myself. I know what slaves feel. I can tell by myself what other slaves feel and by what they have told me. The man that says slaves be quite happy in slavery, that they don't want to be free, that man is either ignorant or a lying person. I never heard a slave say so. I never heard a buckra man say so, till I heard tell of it in England. Such people ought to be ashamed of themselves. They can't do without slaves, they say. What's the reason they can't do without slaves as well as in England? No slaves here. No whips, no stocks, no punishment, except for wicked people. They hire servants in England, and if they don't like them, they send them away. They can't lick them. Let them work ever so hard in England. They are far better off than slaves. If they get a bad master, they give warning and go hire to another. They have their liberty. That's just what we want. We don't mind hard work. If we had proper treatment and proper wages like English servants and proper time given in the week to keep us from breaking the Sabbath. But they won't give it. They will have work, 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 night and day, sick or well, till we are quite done up, and we must not speak up nor look amiss, however much we be abused. And then, when we are quite done up, who cares for us more than for a lame horse? This is slavery. I tell it, to let English people know the truth, and I hope they will never leave off to pray God and call loud till the great King of England, till all the poor blacks be given free and slavery done up forevermore." End quote. That is from the narrative of Mary Prince. If you look up Mary Prince, you will see pictures. They are not of her. the internet has created some false information about her, but her story is she's very much a real person. This is very much her story. And so you can still learn a lot about her from her words. But unfortunately, there are no existing pictures of her because I would love to include one if I could. And I also just wanted to, let you know about the misinformation. Then I have another primary source, although this one takes a bit of a different form. So there's a book by Hannah Crafts, and it's called The Bondswoman Narrative, and it's a part fiction, part autobiographical recount of her life as an enslaved woman in America. And I know this is about Britain, but it's very interesting because she uses the British literature that was seen as so romanticized and so respectful and so high class. We have evidence that she actually would read or somehow steal time or steal books to read them from the library at the house where she was being kept in enslavement. And she used them to write a little bit about her experience. And since I am running out of time, I'm going to read the most important passage, and I might do a part 2 of this episode. But there is a part where she is being forced as punishment for being accused of saying something unkind about her mistress, which she did not say. She is being accused of having done this wrong, and then she's being forced into a marriage that she does not want to be a part of. So here's her thoughts on that. Had Mrs. Wheeler condemned me to the severest corporeal punishment or exposed me to be sold in the public slave market in Wilmington, I should probably have resigned myself with apparent composure to her cruel behests. But when she sought to force me into a compulsory union with a man whom I could only hate and despise, it seemed that rebellion would be a virtue, that duty to myself and my God actually required it, and that whatever accidents or misfortunes might attend my flight, nothing could be worse than what threatened my stay. Marriage, like many other blessings, I considered to be especially designed for the free, and something that all the victims of slavery should avoid as tending essentially to perpetuate that system. Hence, to all overtures of that kind, from whatever quarter they might come, I had invariably turned a deaf ear. I had spurned domestic ties, not because my heart was hard, but because it was my unalterable resolution never to entail slavery on any human being. And now, when I had voluntarily renounced the society of those I might have learned to love, should I be compelled to accept one whose person and speech and manner could not fail to be ever regarded by me with loathing and disgust, then to be driven into the fields beneath the eye and lash of the brutal overseer, and those miserable huts, with their promiscuous crowds of dirty, obscene, and degraded objects, for my home, I would not bear it." End quote. And I will finish off today with Hannah Craft's very own renunciation of slavery that I think is very, very powerful. I'm just finding which page it's on. Alex, do you have any thoughts about or questions about anything as we're wrapping up?
For the Mary Prince, around what year was that?
Mary Prince was the late, I want to say, so this is
'cause it's after slavery.
This is quite later. So Mary Prince's autobiography is earlier than Hannah Craft's
okay.
writing year.
But I can also look it up later.
It's about the 1820s or 1830s.
Okay, that's all I was curious about.
It's published in London, Edinburgh in 1831.
Okay.
And then this one is about a little bit after Bleak House. So this is this one was never actually published during her lifetime, but it was probably written in the 1850s or 1860s. And sorry, there's one quote that's really important that I read. We're in an unusual booth today, folks, so things got a little bit disorganized. I will read it to you guys in part 2, but that is just a little bit about the history of slavery. I'm going to have a part 2 because there is more than I could ever cover, and I just think it's such an important issue, and I just really want, what I want you guys to take away is that there were people standing up for themselves and fighting against these circumstances, and people wanted to be free, and they wanted to find a way to be free, and they were being forced to produce food for people who are not themselves, and forced to do things for people who are not themselves and do really difficult things. I found the quote, so I'm going to read it, and that's going to be my sign off. Oh, you must not ask me such questions. Indeed, you must not. It might involve us in a great deal of trouble. I have learned what all who live in a land of slavery must learn sooner or later, that it is to profess approbation where you cannot feel it, to be hard when most inclined to melt, and to say that all is right and good and true when you know that nothing could be more wrong and unjust. End quote. So I wish you all the best. You can contact me at albiontonight@gmail.com, and I will see you for slavery part 2 and then colonialism and food. Thank you so much. Please email me with questions, and please email me if there's anything you would like me to address. And I will see you another night. Bye-bye.